Welcome to Talking Events. We are at the IBID offices in Richmond, southwest London. As ever, get in touch with us via Twitter using the @TalkingEvents handle if you've got any questions or comments on the podcast. Today we're going to be discussing CDM, a topic that has been widely publicised, I suppose, over the last few months within many different sectors of the events industry and wider to the events industry, of course. Joining the podcast today, Simon Garrett, Managing Director of X-Venture. Good afternoon, Simon.
Good afternoon.
Andrew Harrison, Director of the Event Supply and Services Association. Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Jonathan Smith, Head of Operations at Farnborough International Airshow. Jonathan, welcome to Talking Events.
Good afternoon.
The three gentlemen joining the podcast today have all been involved in a roadshow that's been working its way around the country over the last few months, looking at CDM and what it means to the events industry. So, Andrew, let's come to you first of all. Tell us about the roadshow, who's running it, who the driving force behind it, why it was conceived.
Okay, so the roadshows was conceived quite a long way down the road in terms of our engagement and Simon and Jonathan's engagement with CDM. But it was conceived by the Cross Association Working Group, or Task Force as it is better known as well. Organisers, venues and suppliers, about 25 individuals. And having got towards the end of what we needed to do with regards to industry-specific guidance and implementation, we decided that we needed to continue the education process. We didn't want it just to peter out. We didn't want people to start worrying. There was a lot of information being put out into the market, some of it correct, some of it slightly incorrect, some of it misleading, some of it even a little bit scary. Mm-hmm. So we felt the roadshows was our way of, or the task force way of grabbing hold of this information that we'd helped put together, working with the HSE, and go on the road in the south, in the Midlands, in the north, and dispel a lot of the myths and misconceptions, allow people to ask a lot of honest and straightforward questions, and hopefully put a few minds at rest, as well as delivering the facts.
In many respects, that's why we've got you guys in to the Talking Events studio today, because there has been such a lot of publicity that's gone out in various different media outlets about CDM, lots of different companies and people in different sectors of the events industry writing about what it will mean to organisers and to companies and to suppliers. So this was very much a necessary task, wasn't it, Simon, in order to make sure that people have a very, very clear understanding of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most of my client base are the larger companies in the industry, and I was advising them, and they'd already formulated their plans. They had a pretty good idea of what was going to be required. But there are a lot of other companies out there, the smaller companies, not as well resourced, without access to professional health and safety advice, and this was hugely useful for getting the message to a lot wider audience for two reasons, really. From my own client's point of view, it meant that the smaller companies that they were dealing with were then, or hopefully will as it rolls out, show up with a better knowledge of what's required, and from that point of view, it's been very useful. But also for me as an independent consultant, and it may sound sort of counterintuitive to say this, but I've been able to refer a lot of folk back to ESSA and AEO and AEV and the products that came out of those roadshows to say, look, there's a lot of self-help stuff out there. You can refer to that. You don't actually need a consultant. Because what they were asking me was actually sort of fairly small stuff, and so it's provided that platform as well.
Being on the panel of the roadshow, Jonathan, what are some of the common questions that have cropped up from the audience members and from the participants of these roadshows?
I think from all of them, I think it's interesting actually, and again picking up on Simon saying is that what it threw up. I think it threw up a general awareness as well for general health and safety. Although it was sort of CDM was the topic, I think what it did is it exposed, I think, a few people to something they maybe should have known, should have been more involved in. And I think it certainly raised some interesting questions, because on the roadshow, one of the questions is, and you had some fairly senior people there from both venues, contractors, and organisers. And I think when we did a little bit of a sort of put your hands up, who's read the regulations, I think that demonstrated how deep or how shallow some of these people had actually taken the sort of health and safety responsibilities. So although I said we're here to talk about CDM, I think what it did, as I said, it raised the bar as far as people's roles and responsibilities in health and safety generally, not just the CDM.
Just because people hadn't necessarily read the specifics relating to CDM that came into effect on the 6th of April this year, did that necessarily mean that they weren't taking a good stance on their health and safety applications within their events, or does one naturally lead to the other?
Well, it's funny enough. I had a meter earlier on with a company who was asking me specifically about CDM regulations, and halfway through the conversation, I was able to say, well, hang on a sec. I think there's a few other things we need to straighten out as well, and it's just as Jonathan said. It's caused a lot of companies to actually look at their arrangements that they already have and their compliance with the law. I mean, a lot of what was said previously and in the roadshows was, don't worry, if you're complying with health and safety law, you'll be fine with the regulations. That is to a certain extent true, but that is the if. And I think a few companies have found that on closer scrutiny, they weren't actually up to the health and safety mark anyway, and it's caused them to go and sort of look again, because there's no doubt that CDM will usher in a sort of greater degree of scrutiny, whether it's by the authorities or organisers looking at the whole supply chain down through the various contractors and exhibitors.
What's the
on that one, James, is I think also that sort of where roles and responsibilities sat. And I think what CDM has done, and I think that raised some of the questions you're asking, what questions raised, whether you're a venue, whether you're an organiser, whether you're a contractor, I think it's made it a lot clearer, whether people agree with it or not, or are unaware of it, it's made it a lot clearer where people did turn up, run their event, and some venues are better than others, some organise better than others, some contractors are better than others. But depending on where you are, maybe the venue took a lead on some of these responsibilities, whereas obviously CDM has shown that maybe not to be the case. And so again, it's demonstrated to the people that maybe weren't so clear. It's a lot clearer now regarding where those roles and responsibilities do sit.
I think that's in many ways the beauty of the stable of associations as well, because we've worked together on so many other things. It was very easy to pull a lot of this information together. I mean, these guys sat next to me are the experts. The associations, we never claimed to be practitioners in this, but they were brilliant in coming together, explaining their own areas of concern, and moving that forward through the various methods of apps, roadshows, and documentation.
Well, I think picking up on that, Andrew, I think the roadshows have been very useful. I think it's the same as a lot of these subjects, is if you're in the know and you're interested, you'll be attending those. I think one of the challenges, although it's being led by the trade associations, the AOA, the ESSA, what we're all very conscious of is obviously the guys outside that organisations, which obviously there are a lot of. And this is why I think, and maybe Andrew can expand on that a little bit more, is that regarding just getting the word out to the industry. As I said, it's not a secret society.
Have the roadshows been limited to members of the organisations that are driving it?
No, not at all. They're available to anybody who's interested in coming and finding out more. We publicised them through the press via our own membership. Asked our members to pass them on to the wider audience, and the same with our documentation. It's freely available on all association websites. There's no login required. Same with the app. It is free to download for whoever wishes to download it from, and there is obviously the website portal as well, which is again free to log on to and start going with it.
I think that's been an impressive part of the whole thing. That, it certainly impressed me. It is the amount of goodwill that's been involved from right across the board in saying, okay, this is an industry problem, and it needs these need an industry approach and industry solutions, and it's. From the beginning, it's been like that, and a lot of people have sort of contributed their thoughts, and then a lot of people are sharing sort of products and saying, well, how are you doing it, and how are you filling out this particular form, etc. And it's a good model, and it's a good base if we were ever to face something like this again, which we surely will at some point. But that has been an impressive part of it, that sort of coming together from an industry response point of view.
Yeah, I think that's true, because I think there has been situations prior to this where maybe we've ended up in a few little silos regarding whether, again, going back to the sort of three main points of the organiser, contractor or venue, and picking up on Simon, I said it pulled us together into a situation where we needed to treat it as an industry, and I think that's absolutely right. We've now got an ongoing working group which is ready for the next thing that's coming down the pipe. So that's a really good place to be.
I'm interested to look at some of the actual practicalities of CDM and the impact it will have on day-to-day operations for organisers, for suppliers, for contractors, for venues. First of all, from a policing point of view, the HSE ultimately will be the ones responsible for making sure that people are implementing and deploying CDM correctly. How is it going to be policed? I've seen the term self-regulation seems to have appeared an awful lot in the last few months, and I don't quite know what to make of the term self-regulation.
Right, it's a very good question. I mean, you got to realise, of course, that April the 6th this came in. We're beginning to see a little bit of feedback from events and consultants like me on the sort of encounters they've had with CDM, but we haven't got a lot to go on. The HSE have said that proportionality is the sort of watchword here, so that they're going to apply this proportionately, i.e. they're not just going to steamroll in and make life difficult for the sake of it. We haven't seen any evidence yet, because nothing's really happened. But it does, you're quite right, it does change the policing. I mean, in my background, it was as venue background, and as a director of a major venue, we used to make sure that, there was only so far the organiser was going to go before they did something that they shouldn't have done. But that has changed now. The venue's role is reduced to that of a contractor for practical purposes. So yes, it is a lot down to the organiser to get their house in order. And of course, we'll see, the proof of pudding will be in the eating when there is a major problem at some point, and then the HSE shows up. We'll see how it rolls from there.
Is it naive of me to think that there will be, or there have been already scenarios where the HSE will just knock on the door of an event and say, right, we're here to spot check you?
I think there's been a number of, my colleagues in the industry, I've, visited a couple, and it's been reported that a couple of venues and events have been visited. But I think to pick up on, the HSE have been very consistent on this one, is they are appreciating there is a bedding in period, or even for some of the larger events, this is a slight change. And even if you've been running your event and you're organising and the infrastructure has been very close to CDM, if not in CDM words, it has taken a little bit of time. But my feedback, from certainly discussing with HSE and is that they're obviously looking at the high risk activities on site, whether it's CDM or not. That's not necessarily just going to be CDM, and that's the old age high risks of things like working at height as an example. Now, if they're going to come onto site, which they have been on, I know, a number of high-level events, that's what they're looking at. And they've made it very, very clear that they're not particularly looking at CDM as a priority, but obviously that will come into play. But they are obviously looking at the high risk of, as I said, working at height, use of plant, etc., like that, which they would have done a year ago, 2 years ago. And they're being consistent on that one.
Well, festivals, events like Farnborough, for example, we'll use Farnborough as an example. The sheer scale of them and the nature of what's going on that site during your production build, if we can call it that, it will very much feel like a construction site, and construction ultimately is the key word here and what we come back to with CDM. Is CDM fair on smaller events? Fairs, things organised by local authorities in town centres. Is CDM? Is there any movement at all for your size of event or your scale of event, or is this one set of regulations that applies to everything, regardless of how big or small?
Well, that's the nub of the issue. And I wouldn't be impertinent enough to say that Jonathan's job is easy, because they're far from it. But the larger, well-established events and festivals have got their house in order, because then they've got the resources to deal with CDM. In theory, CDM applies to a student job fair with a few pop-ups. Now, I think on one of my blogs I actually said, it applies to a WI jam and bake sale, which is clearly ridiculous. And, CDM is fundamentally unsuitable for the events industry. We went in knowing that. What we've done is sort of, I suppose, pummeled it into manageable proportions in a way and saying, okay, well, it is what it is, so we're just going to have to deal with it. A large number of these type of events will just carry on and will be oblivious to CDM, and the HSE will go nowhere near them because, there's, so it in theory applies, but nothing will happen.
I think that's right. As it's proportionate to everything. At the end of the day, there's only X amount of resource on this. But as I said, what it has done, and the AGC, I think this whole, whether it's 3-4 years, which it has been, it's been a long road. It has given both sides, I think, a much clearer understanding of where they are. In fairness, HSE were a name to a lot of people that never ever knew who they were. They were a sort of faceless organisation. I think we can certainly the three of us sat here, know a number of key individuals now that if we have any issues, we know exactly who to pick up and ring and contact, and they will very openly support you. So I think it's been a really good exercise in that sense.
I agree. I was going to say it's been another key element of the exercise is to bring a face, a personality to the HSE. Because, like I said, when we started dealing with this issue 4 years ago, there was the fear factor. There was the, don't talk to them because you're raising your head. Let's hope it just goes away. But it's not the tactic we generally wanted to adopt.
You've touched then on my next question, which was how forthcoming with the HSE in terms of engaging with the events industry and recognising the fact that although these regulations apply fundamentally to the events industry, that there were going to be significant differences between the events industry and the construction industry. So how forthcoming were they in engaging and speaking to people and finding out how or what the best way forward was in order to apply these regulations?
I mean, it must be said there was a rocky start. I don't think they had actually looked at the event. I don't know, but I suspect that they looked at the events industry and had the idea of a few festivals and and then actually when the industry responded to their consultation exercise, began to realise that this was a lot bigger animal than they had originally thought, and also highly complex and a lot more damage. And I think they started to get an idea of the damage that could be done if they were heavy-handed with this. So there was very I don't know where the turning point is. Maybe you saw it, but there was a point at which suddenly there was a standoff, and then they thought, actually, both sides thought, actually, we're going to have to talk to each other, sensibly about this. Mm-hmm. After that, it became a lot easier.
I think once there was acknowledgement of competency on both sides, at the end of the day, I think it takes that. I think there was that sort of walking in through the bar sort of thing, bang, open the doors, suddenly thinking, oh, hang on a sec, actually, the events, although maybe fragmented because you've got festivals and exhibitions and live events. We are quite fragmented, but although we're quite a small industry. So I think once that sort of competency was found, I think there was definitely then a coming together and realise that, hang on, there's a result to be got here for both sides.
From a trade association point of view, Andrew, was there a point where the association was engaging with the HSE and where there was a moment of sort of acceptance that, okay, we all know what we're talking about here and we now trust that, so let's move forward?
There was. I mean, it gathered pace, and it gathered pace quite quickly towards the end. But as I touched upon a moment ago, we're going back 4 years where Chris Skeeth, my predecessor, first took this up with the HSE when we came onto their radar in and around the Olympics and over temporary structures. Was when they first started to engage with some of our members. Our members spoke to us, and not much happened for a couple of years, and it all went a bit quiet. And to be honest, with conversations with the HSE, it felt as though it had gone away. And then they decided it wasn't going to go away. So what we did with regards to the task force is create a campaign. And in fact, there was a period of feedback where they asked for various industries to comment on the proposals, and I think it must have been at least 70-80% of the forms that were filled in and submitted to the HSE on this particular subject were from our members, so from across the organisers, the venues, and the suppliers. And so at that point, they decided to engage in an economic study to see what the impact would be. And that would have been, I'd say, maybe last June. So that's when it started to gather pace. They then stopped the economic study and actually decided they were going to enforce these new regulations on our industry. But what they wanted to do is sit down with the associations and create industry specific. And I would say from about last November onwards, it really picked up a pace in terms of creating this industry specific guidance and enforcing it come April.
You mentioned the word economics. Cost. How will it affect organisers?
Well, I think that's where it's coming back to. I think it was a question, earlier, maybe we didn't answer it probably, but I think you were saying to the little guy and the big guys.
Very much so, yeah.
The big guys, as I say, and I think Simon mentioned it, is that, we were already, resourced and ready and running our events fairly well. And although we've had to sort of rename and reword a few things, I think, but the little guy down the road who does come under CDM, I think that's where it's not particularly a cost, but it's where is there support for them. And I think this again is, and maybe Andrew's a better one to answer that, because there is various resources out there, and whether it's resource packs and a new app that's come out, which again I'll leave Andrew to point on. But there is definitely, and out of this task group and out of this working group, there has definitely come additional support now, not just for the big boys, but for the medium and the smaller guys as well, who would never have even heard of CDM and haven't never heard of health and safety. So that's where we've got to.
Looking at then, is it fair to say that there's not necessarily going to be a huge cost implication even to the smaller organisers, provided that they access information and resources that are now being made available to them, and that they're aware that those resources are there?
I mean, I have a few caveats with this. I think in an ideal world, there probably wouldn't be a great deal of cost imposed, but there will be some in costs. The issue is, and if you look at why they revised the CDM regulations, these are not new regulations, they always existed. They just never applied to the events industry. And the 94 and subsequent 2007 regs were far too onerous, sort of gold-plated regulations that pushed up costs for the construction industry. And so the whole point of this was to strip that out. But the reason it needed doing, was because when the regulations were brought in, they were gold-plated, and then the response that followed it meant that the construction industry was saddled with a lot of costs. I think it's too early to say whether we've avoided this yet, but you can see how it runs if you get a health and safety consultant who, is a jobbing consultant and lives by the next job he or she gets, going to someone and saying, right, CDM, there's a few things you need to do here. And all of a sudden, we're filling in forms and adding costs that we don't need to do. And we are a bit prone, not just the events industry, but industry in general. So I think if we're not careful, a lot of these costs will be self-inflicted by overzealous health and safety consultants, dare I say, and also perhaps local authorities and the more minor officials that actually don't understand the regulations, and perhaps even more risk-adverse type organisations. You see the charity sector and the like might be saying, okay, but we've got to make really, really sure. So we must guard against that and take sensible, proportionate decisions so that we don't actually do that. That said, we do have challenges in the business, they've already been mentioned, like working at heights and moving heavy plant and stuff like that. And, this will be the point which finally we're going to have to face those and deal with them, and that will incur costs.
But what we mustn't forget is and I think we actually touched on this, is what is the CDM trying to do? And I think at the end of the day, what it is to obviously coordinate a very safe site, and that's really what CDM is about. It's coordinating contractors, making sure that people who are coming onto site are aware of their responsibilities and welfare. Many of us, I think, have been on more traditional building sites, and you've seen the large hoardings and that go up on a permanent building site of a housing development. That's obviously something that was one of the challenges actually that we had with the HSE. That obviously that's a cost implication that you can't physically do on a 2-day show that's going in and then waiting for another show to come back in again. So so that's that's what it is about. It's about creating a safe environment. That's what all health and safety is about.
There is an acceptance. I get the feeling within the industry that this is generally speaking a good thing because it's about creating a safer environment for everybody. Is there any danger at all, just to throw a hand grenade in here, that this is a bit of a Trojan horse, and the creativity and the flair that fundamentally, is apparent in all aspects of the event industry becomes over-regulated, and that this CDM becomes a bit of a Trojan horse to create tighter regulations in what is ultimately a very creative industry?
I use that term myself, actually, some way back, and said, look, the HSE, and I posed the question, are the HSE using this as a Trojan horse to get a handle on an industry where they haven't had any sway? I mean, the HSE does have ultimate authority when it comes to health and safety enforcement, but it was the local authorities that did this on a day-to-day basis. And if you were a conspiracy theorist, you'd be looking at all government departments being sort of cut back and saying, fine, here they're now they see this huge industry. I think there is a danger that if you, but I don't think it's any more than any other regulation, and there's plenty of them out there that we stifle creativity. I do think, and there is a wider danger at a macro level, you've got to add in all of the other things we're doing. We've had changes in electrical regulations previously, that there are tightening of rules here and there. There will be a point at which exhibitors and organisers, review perhaps the economic viabilities of running shows in UK exhibition centres. Now, I don't think we're anywhere near that yet, but that is it is, if you continue to impose regulation that is too prescriptive and too restrictive, then ultimately that's where you're going to end up. And the skill, if you like, with sort of professional operations teams like Farnborough and consultants like me, is to try and find the solution that meets the requirements of the regulations while still allowing all of the creativity. So, as a health and safety consultant, I would always say, look, it isn't just about loss prevention. It is business enablement to be able to do this. Formula One racing is only possible because of very sophisticated risk management, modules, not in spite of them. And if you look at it that way, then it doesn't need to be a strangle on creativity, but there is a danger if you don't keep an eye on it.
And that was something quite early on with our discussions with HSC, that, on behalf of sort of UK PLC here, is that there's a larger exhibitions, smaller exhibitions. What we certainly didn't want to do is create any more red tape that would give everybody the ammunition to say, Simon says, we're not going to go over here, we're going to run our show in Germany or France, and we're going to take it away from the UK. So that was something that was made very aware. It wasn't made aware at the beginning, but certainly was taken on board during our discussions.
Like anything, you can do an awful lot of consultation prior to the actual regulation coming in, but until it goes live and until it starts to be applied in a real life scenario, you won't really know whether or not you've got it 100% right. 5 months in, are there any examples thus far of flaws, loopholes, grey areas, things that may need to be revised fairly quickly or even in the medium term?
Yeah, sorry, go on. You.
From an association point of view, I mean, we have a huge amount of information now available. And I suppose from our point of view, we were even guilty of overcomplicating it from the start. So already, 4 months in, we're looking to simplify versions of what we've already released. Again, are there any stats thus far? I know it's in its infancy in the grand scheme of things, but are we already seeing actual facts and figures come back in terms of? Are there any sort of reduction?
No, there aren't anything particularly, and I think this is a sign of the way forward. I think is that we've already sort of put a peg in the ground. I think for the back end of this year, to probably sit down with the HSC and almost have not a wash up, because this is an ongoing project, but almost, guys, where are we at? How did it perform? There's enough of us around that said from different aspects that said I've certainly made it clear that I've been around and talking to some of my colleagues in the industry and visited several events that have had visits, And I think in the HSE, I think it's a new dawn. I think we will be sitting down in later on in the year and sitting down and saying, how did we all do, and can we do better? So, and then again, that's only going to create a better relationship going forward. So, but as it stands, no, there aren't any particular statistics at the moment, unless anybody knows.
I think
otherwise.
it's a lot slower burn, actually. I mean, I'm not necessarily, we shouldn't sit down and discuss how it went, but I've seen this over a couple of decades at least. I can well remember from my time running a venue that, where, the 92 regulations requiring a risk assessment had been in place for, since 1992, and there we were in 2000, and it was like trying to get blood out of a stone, now, it's just the way we do stuff, risk assessments, and nobody questions it, but it took a long time for people to absorb it. Now, I think there is a degree of urgency here because this whole thing has been thrown into the spotlight. There's far more. I mean, one of the things that we haven't mentioned, of course, in this, that the regulations, not just the change in there being imposed on the events industry, but is also they have changed in terms of how they're imposed on the construction industry generally. And one of the big changes is the emphasis on, the client, which is the basically the owner of the event, and their responsibilities, and it places that responsibility a lot higher up, and the responsibility, if they weren't aware of it before, very firmly in the boardroom. So I think when that penny drops, we'll see a much swifter, adoption of what's needed.
Well, on the subject of boardroom level and responsibility, I'd like to actually just see if we can get some advice for people listening to this and for organisers who are listening to the podcast. When we talk about client, principal designer, principal contractor, the three terms that crop up fairly regularly in a lot of the coverage that I've read in the last few months have seen generated. Let's talk a little bit about the process of appointing those and perhaps dispel the myth a little bit that it was going to be a complicated process, that it was going to incur all this additional cost or additional effort in employing these specific people, and how organisers can actually apply and meet these three key positions.
Well, it's actually quite simple. I mean, the nominate, figuring out who does what is actually quite simple. Living up to those requirements is the tricky bit. I mean, essentially, the client is the party or individual on whose behalf the event is being run. So that's usually where the ownership lies. Principal designer is the architect of the event, and then the principal contractor is the party responsible for actually running the thing on the ground. It's usually the operations team. For most, Farnborough is a very different animal in that respect, but for most exhibition organisers, they embody all three of those, as so it'll be ABC Exhibitions Limited will be each one of those, and within the organisation there will be individuals who are having to deliver on those responsibilities.
This is probably about 80% of all the documentation we've put together, sent out, and the information within the app in what it details.
Well, we should touch on this then. Let's introduce it properly, Andrew, because there is an app that is available or will be available.
No, it's been available since Monday, so it's available in the Apple Store, Microsoft, and the Google Play.
Okay.
And there's also a web version as well.
Give us the headlines on it. What is it? What does it do, and how will it help people?
Well, from what Simon's just says, it helps give people information in terms of understanding roles and responsibilities under CDM. And it breaks it down in terms of organizer responsibilities, venue responsibilities, contractor responsibilities, main contractor responsibilities, and exhibitor responsibilities, and understanding your role within CDM regulations. It breaks it down under those titles, and then it gives you all the ability to complete all the relevant documentation that you would need, from risk assessments, method statements, and so on. Save them, submit them, save them and email them to yourself so you can submit them to an organizer. And I mean, it's quite a simple, straightforward function in that sense, but it also sets the scene in terms of what we've tried to discuss here, in terms of how far this goes back.
And it will be accessible just via mobile devices or online as well?
Online, so there is a website as well, which is cdm4events.org.uk. So that's where anyone can access it from their PCs.
And we'll certainly be tweeting some links out via the @TalkingEvents Twitter handle. If
yeah,
you've
and
got
in the
links and
various
stuff that we can
stores,
share.
it's just searching for CDM4 events.
Excellent. In terms of how, going back to these roles, Jonathan, your role is in operations at Farnborough. Will that see you actually assume one of these roles that are described in CDM?
Yeah, as you say, as Simon says, it basically, and this has again been accepted by the HSE, which again I think they took trouble understanding at the beginning, is that can be one, the one organisation can abridge several of those roles. And like with ourselves, our ops team within, the airshow organisation, obviously the principal designer is also steps over as being the client as well. Obviously then we have our contractors sitting below us. So again, it is quite simple. And so it isn't black and white like that. It's up to yourself to really sort of make, and once you start sitting down with some of your contractors or even with some of the resource material it is quite straightforward. And again, there is no crime about getting that not slightly right or slightly wrong. Again, take some little bit of advice on somebody who might know better, whether it's the venue or an organiser. So this is where the venues said their responsibility is taking a slightly sort of back step, but at the same time they also are some of the most experienced places to go to that make people seek advice on. So again, there's plenty of material online that can just guide you in that zone. But it isn't as clear as black and white. Every event, I think almost every event is probably slightly unique in terms of how they're doing it. Because some organisers have their own in-house teams. Some organisers might use outsource to a support production company. So depending on how you're running your event, it will change.
It's a very good point, actually. That it is criminal law, but Jonathan's absolutely right that there will be no repercussions if you write the wrong name in the wrong box. And I would add, to that is that this isn't about form filling. This isn't. Yes, there is a certain amount of that has to go on. Fundamentally, it is about people at all levels, from the board level downwards, taking responsibility for health and safety on site. That is the key issue. And once you do that, filling out a few forms to support that and comply with CDM regs doesn't become that complicated. And people shouldn't be afraid of it.
Given how well the industry has engaged, we talked earlier in the podcast about how well the industry as a whole have spoken and liaised with one another for the benefit of the entire industry. The roadshow thus far has very much been a process of educating organisers and giving them the information that they need and answering the questions that they've got as it stands. Longer term, is there any are there any plans to actually get people to, again, further down the line and look at how it's been implemented and take people's feedback and continue this process of communication?
Yeah, absolutely. From an association point of view, I mean, I think Jonathan mentioned it earlier on. The CDM task force has now become the health and safety working group across all three associations. So it's going to be the job of that group to continue to engage with CDM, continue to engage with the HSE, continue to talk to each other about their experiences. And from our point of view, we'll use that information then and that engagement to keep updating what's available and develop new stuff if it needs developing.
And I can add to that because I'm involved in that group and others, but actually the health and safety consultancy network is a very strong network right across the events industry, festivals, theatres, television, and I think that's what originally slightly wrong-footed the HSE when they realised that we were actually replying with one voice, and very well coordinated it was at the time. And so that, if you like, sits under the formal groupings that have been set up, which can sort of lobby, if you like, and apply a bit of leverage. But that informal grouping sits underneath that too. And we're, emails are flying around all over the place saying, well, I've just had the HSE on site and this is what they asked. So the health and safety network is there to sort of support, if you like, as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'd like to see, sort of, it's always nice to talk about sort of what legacy of all this hard work and things is done. I think the legacy of that is, you say, is a very joined up network of health and safety professionals. whether events, organisers, contractors, and we're all doing our own thing in a certain way, but following the same path. I think the actual joined up associations has been a good piece of work. It's also thrust us further up the food chain as far as representation within HSE. Myself and some colleagues now have a seat at the table on JACE, which is part of the entertainment committee of HSE. So again, it's given us that, which I don't think, not saying I'm going to say we wouldn't have got, but I think it gave us that opportunity to be represented there. But I think going forward, I think it's a lot of everything. Is now and it was interesting. I think a previous podcast was which I listened to with interest regarding where are our new people coming from, where are our new students coming from out of event management courses now, degrees. This is the sort of thing that should be starting to be embedded into their curriculum. And I think, although without dwelling on the point, but this is the sort of information education that has got to start going into some of this sort of curriculum at ground level.
Absolutely. And as always, we always put the call out in the podcasts for people to get in touch with questions, with comments, with their own experiences. It would be interesting to know, as you said, what's going to happen longer term from an event management study point of view, and how embedded this will be at ground level before people are even coming into the industry. And I'm sure further down the line we will want to talk about the longer term impact that these regulations have had as they become a part of the industry. For now, we shall wrap up today's episode of At Talking Events. Get in touch with us. You can watch a video recording of the podcast via the Event Industry News website and via the Event Industry News YouTube channel. Just leaves me to say thank you to Simon Garrett. Thanks for joining us. Andrew Harrison and Jonathan Smith. My name is James Dixon, and this is Talking Events.